Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. Now entering the grid. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Jeremiah.
Welcome back to another episode of Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. We're your hosts, Jeremiah
and Thomas.
So today's going to be an interesting episode as we're going to look at what made Aston Martin great, and to kind of coincide.
Well, hang on. We're calling them great.
They went from 7th to 2nd. You're going to say that's not great?
I'm going to say they're making great strides. Let's get halfway through this season.
All right, that's fair. Okay, what made Aston Martin good?
On the path to greatness.
As Red Bull still triumphs ahead as the dominant car. We're also going to be taking a look at Mercedes and their slight decline in the recent years, as well as Ferrari's gradual decline since, 2010, 2009?
8, when they won their last anything.
Okay, you want to kick us off with Aston Martin?
Sure. So Jeremiah mentioned in the open, Aston Martin, they certainly could in 2023 be considered a great team through the first 3 races, but that's the big caveat, right? First 3 races. We have to see how their reliability holds up. We have to see how their drivers hold up. All of that takes an entire 22 race season to unfold. But Jeremiah is right. They made the jump from the 7th constructor in a struggling 7th constructor, not fighting for the midfield, to being right now a clear number 2. They're probably going to be fighting with Mercedes for that number 2 spot throughout the year. But again, you don't see that kind of jump in Formula One. You don't see a not a back marker, but a bottom of the midfield team suddenly jump up to a contender.
Yeah.
So we're doing a lot of research, reading through articles, pouring through YouTube videos on all the changes that these teams made, specifically starting with Aston Martin. And we got the idea for going into other teams. But to start with Aston Martin, they have overhauled their entire operation. And it shows clearly why in 2023 they are far better than any other year. They've taken way more steps than teams usually take in the offseason.
Okay.
Let's start with their car.
Sure.
The AMR 23. Dan Fallows, which we'll get to in a second, the technical director for Aston Martin, says that this year's car for Aston Martin is 95% different than their previous car.
I mean, why would you want the same car?
Why would you want the same car? One, but I don't think a lot of teams have the money or the resources or the manpower to undergo that big of a car change when there isn't a major regulation change. There were regulation changes between 22 and 23, but not an overhaul like we saw in 2022, right?
Right.
So now you're rolling out essentially an entirely new car when you don't have to. And I think other teams, like you look at Mercedes, you look at Alpine and McLaren, they're still stuck on their first model, their first iteration of the regulation changes. They just add little bits and pieces here. Maybe it's 30% different. Maybe it's 20% different. Theirs is 95% different.
Right, but you got to think about what goes into that. First of all, like you said, complete overhaul of all the staff. That means the people in charge of making the car, which means essentially everybody that made the car, maybe not like the bottom tier people, like at the bottom of the food chain, but as far as who designed that car, they're gone. They're completely gone. And it'd be one thing if a team was creating a brand new car, like by throwing a dart in darkness, just seeing where it lands, and that's what they're going to roll with. But that's not really what's happening here, is it? What's happening is they, like you were about to talk about, they took that Red Bull engineer, brought him over to Aston Martin, and they had specs and kind of a guideline in the direction that they wanted to head. It wasn't necessarily like, well, let's see what this car's going to do.
No, so let's stick with the car, and then we'll go into the personnel that builds it. So one, when you just look at their car, I don't have any backing for this, but whenever you look at the car, I feel like they got their side pod design from Ferrari. It is very similar. And we were talking a couple of weeks ago about how whenever they rolled out the new cars in 2022 and everybody was doing that grid walk in Bahrain and they were all like, ooh, Ferrari's looks they weren't using the word cool, but it looks fast, it looks sleek, right? And it was a fast car. They had some engine issues. But then you look at the Mercedes and it was vastly different. None of those teams, though, changed going from 2022 into 2023. They carried the same design of the car. Maybe they changed the aero package a little bit, the ride height, the weight distribution, something like that. But Aston Martin redesigned a lot of things. So I think they took some inspiration from Ferrari about what was the best component of the Ferrari car. I think they also took inspiration from the best component of the Mercedes car, which was that front wing. And the Mercedes front wing that they rolled out in 2022 and now again in 2023 is, I'm not going to say it's iconic or anything, but if you go give it a look, it is drastically different than every other team's, save for the Mercedes feeder supplier teams like your Aston Martin and Williams, because they copy the same design. It is a huge scoop up on that top tertiary wing flap or whatever they call it. It's a major, like it's a parabolic shape on the top, when all the other teams, it's a flat bar, right?
Interesting.
It's angled, but theirs is angled with a scoop and a sweep.
Okay, and you're saying they got that idea straight from Mercedes?
I don't know if they did, but the fact that
that's
they
where
get
we see it.
They get their engines from Mercedes. And yeah, that's where we saw it initially, was Mercedes. And we know that Mercedes is, one of the design king. Like, people are looking at Mercedes and Red Bull and Ferrari for inspiration. And so Aston Martin probably said, we like that. that looks fast. So you mentioned him earlier, Dan Fallows.
Yes.
Where'd he come from?
Dan Fallows was the number 2 at Red Bull Racing, right underneath the great and almighty Adrian Newey.
Yep. That's about as big of a steal as you can get if you're a team trying to find your next technical director.
Oh, easily. It's like, I guess if you were to compare it in the American sports world to, like, say, football, that would be like taking the offensive coordinator from a Super Bowl winning team and being like, okay, you're the head coach.
It's very similar. And we see this play out. We'll talk about Ferrari here in a little bit. It plays out one of two different ways. You have a number 2 at a team. Were they a huge part of the success and the design and the build? If yes, then they're probably going to do well on your team. If they weren't a huge part of it, or if they had a lot of help or they had a lot of support, it might not translate over.
Yeah.
Your football example, Cliff Kingsbury, an awesome offensive coordinator. He goes to run the Arizona Cardinals and can't do it, right?
Pretty much.
So it's one of two. So they get Dan Fallows. The other big thing, technical, that they're doing, they're building an entire new factory for Aston Martin.
Yeah, that's something that Lawrence Stroll was actually making a big deal about. In fact, how they're going to have all of the new interesting equipment that you would see at like a Mercedes or a Red Bull.
Right.
Supposedly, they're going to have a bunch of different features that aren't at the Mercedes and Red Bull place too. That's going to bring it kind of into the future of tech for racing manufacturing team. I'm kind of excited to see. I don't know if they're going to give like a tour per se, just because I feel like that would.
I bet they will. Well, Red Bull and Mercedes give factory tours.
Okay, then yeah, I'd be excited to see what the factory tour is going to look like when it's completed.
Fly over to Silverstone.
Maybe not the full walk around, but a nice virtual tour,
a Zoom tour.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the big name there, Lawrence Stroll. We've had our differences with how the Stroll family runs things. One, credit to Lawrence, great businessman, clearly super wealthy, bought an F1 team. That sounds awesome. Yeah. I would love to do that. Our only gripe with him is paying your Lance Stroll's career, which I don't fault the father for giving their son a really cool job and career. It's more on the Lance Stroll, like, hey, pay your own way type of thing. But credit to Lawrence Stroll for just absolutely whipping Aston Martin into shape.
Oh, yeah. He took this team as a backmarker team that wasn't, if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't even Aston Martin at the time. It was Racing Point, wasn't it?
Yeah, and they bought them out.
And
their factory looks like junk, and that's probably why they're building a new one. I don't know if you've ever gone and done to. So it's right next to Silverstone. It's in the same area. So like Red Bull's in Milton Keynes, and Mercedes is like right down the street from them in Breckley. But if you look at Aston Martin's, it's literally across the street from Silverstone, and it looks like a warehouse in a dirt alley.
Oh no! No.
So Lawrence Stroll stepped out of his like $200,000 car and said, "This don't work.
It's not gonna fly. This place looks like a rundown Home Depot."
Jeremiah also mentioned that they don't have things now like wind tunnel testing. How does Aston Martin get wind tunnel testing now?
As for right now, they're having to use the Mercedes wind tunnel. Obviously, that's part of the whole Mercedes package with them having the engine and probably same test drivers, some to that effect.
Yep.
But they're definitely using the wind tunnel over there.
So as part of the new factory, they said that Lawrence Stroll said that everything's going to be state of the art, and they're going to have a wind tunnel testing. They're going to have simulators. They're going to have all these different ways of testing the car's performance that they don't currently have in their actual factory. What they're doing, because the factory's not done yet.
Right.
They're using it, but it's not done yet. So whatever they have completed at the new factory, they're using, and whatever they don't have, they're reverting to the old factory. So right now, they're kind of getting the best of both worlds. They're saying, hey, we know how to build a car in this factory that we have, but when we need some extra data or metrics or whatever, we can go over to the new factory and use the cool new stuff that we have. So they're making huge improvements.
I like it, and I think they'll make even bigger improvements once they do have that wind tunnel and all the other features in one building, and they don't have to communicate via cell phone miles away or something like that.
Transport the car on a flatbed.
I'll take pictures of the front end, and you tell me what you think of it. Like,
you got one guy standing in one factory just on the phone while they're live testing.
I just sent you pictures.
I'm going to airdrop these to you. Yeah. Okay, so Jeremiah also mentioned another key thing. Aston Martin and Mercedes and Williams are all in the same little bubble, and they share parts and drivers and trade secrets of how to build a car, even though they're not supposed to.
To an extent, yeah.
That was covered extensively with Racing Point Force India, right? Whenever they rolled out the pink thing.
And it was the exact same car that
as
Mercedes
the
has.
Mercedes car. So they've had issues with this in the past, but everybody knows that goes on in Formula One. But something that Aston Martin started last year that you would not expect out of a midfield or backmarker team.
What's that?
Driver Academy.
Oh, yeah. They started their own driver's academy.
The AMF1 Driver Development Program. And it's all spelled all European-like with a bunch of extra E's and stuff.
Okay. Tell me about some of the drivers in there.
So the first driver that they added in their current reserve and test driver, Philip Drugovich.
Ooh, F1 or F2 champ, rather.
The 2022 F2 champ. He also won some other Formula feeder series that are Europe-based, not like the F4, F3 series. They were local-based, but he did win the legit F2 2022 champion, and now he is Aston Martin's reserve and test driver.
That's a pretty good get.
So you're no longer, you're not sharing information with other teams. That is your guy to test your car. No one else is.
Pretty cool.
So if you're going to get a guy to do that for you, Lawrence Stroll clearly said, I'm getting the best. And the best from last year was Drugovich.
Right.
And now he's on staff with Aston Martin, which also means, take Alpine out of the mix, he's next in line for whatever driver's seat they have open up at Aston Martin.
I wonder if this gives Mercedes access to Felipe or if it's its own separate thing, completely independent from the Mercedes contract.
I don't know. I would guess it's completely different because why would
it's a completely different driver academy?
Yeah, why would you start your own?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And this probably also, I don't know how I imagine with the driver academy things, there has to be some payment from Aston Martin going to Mercedes to use their reserve drivers.
Well, hold on. Because if I'm not mistaken, George Russell came up through the Williams F1 Academy?
No, Mercedes.
He did?
Yeah.
Isn't there a Williams F1 Academy? I swear there is. Hold on.
I don't know.
Pause that real quick. We got to do some research. Because I feel like I
thought he was always with, it says they have one. He didn't go through it, though.
Okay.
So he was part of the Mercedes system. So they do have their own thing,
okay.
but he was part of their own thing.
I see that.
Lance Stroll went through the Williams thing. And if you remember, if you watch Drive to Survive, the first season of Drive to Survive, they talk about that because Lance Stroll is with Williams.
Okay, so that makes a little bit more sense. So they have their own drivers academy, and they're going to bring their own drivers through that have no correlation whatsoever to the Mercedes program.
It's kind of genius.
It is genius.
They're building a legit constructor right now.
Step by step, man.
I have one more note, and then I want you to bring up possibly the biggest note for this year. Lawrence fired Otmar. It says Otmar left. I have no doubt in my mind that Lawrence said, "You ain't cutting it, Otmar. Get out."
Which, I mean, do you blame him?
No, they mutually parted ways or whatever.
Right.
No.
So in other words, he walked into the office and they were like, "Listen, man, you got two options in front of you. You can walk out on mutual terms, or we can say you're fired. It's your pick."
You'll never work in this business again.
Gosh.
So who'd they bring in to replace him? Mike Crack.
Oh.
And all of this was done obviously about a season and a half ago. But Mike Crack has he's a motorsport tenured guy. Like this is all he's done.
Right.
But he spent decades with the Porsche and BFW systems as an engineer, and so he's kind of coming in with that Matteo Binotto type approach to, hey, I'm going to build a really good car. Didn't work with Ferrari, but currently they're making it work with Aston Martin with him running the show.
Yeah, and maybe there was bits and pieces of that. Like we always hear talks of how Ferrari likes to intervene, and maybe to an extent they were holding him back on what his designs could have been.
Yeah, possibly. Okay, I'm not going to say it's the biggest change, but personnel-wise, what's the biggest thing that Aston Martin did this year?
How about two-time World Drivers Champion Fernando Alonso?
Yeah. I was skeptical. What were your thoughts whenever you heard that he was leaving Alpine, who was not a contender, but like a legit, they could get number 3 if they tried, to go to Aston Martin?
Here's what I think. Here's what I felt when I first heard the news. And I don't know how it's going to be perceived. You might say I'm lying. That's fine. My first initial reaction was, oh no, you mean he's going from best of the rest to back of the pack?
Yeah.
That's not a good move. Then I saw an article where it talked about how he had been in conversation with Lawrence Stroll, and Lawrence Stroll was, taking him around to meet some of the faculty and everything that's around there. And he left that, I guess, meeting with Lawrence Stroll talking about how they're putting all these plans in place. They really look like they're going to be chasing a championship. They're doing the right steps, making the initial moves. And when I heard him say that, he didn't say that about Alpine. He didn't say that about McLaren. He didn't say that about anybody. So when I heard him talking about Aston Martin in this way, I kind of had hope. But I'll say this. I did not expect how far they came. I was expecting them to bring the fight to Alpine and McLaren for that best of the rest.
Because that would be reasonable.
Right.
You go from 7 to maybe
4,
5th.
5.
Yeah. I get what you mean. So whenever they made this move, obviously this was during the time we'd started, getting really into the sport. We were watching all the races, and,
right.
and this was part of our daily talks now was all of Formula One. And we said, hey, Fernando Alonso is going from Alpine to Aston Martin. And I thought it was a pure money deal. I just thought they offered him more money.
He's getting some of that Stroll money.
Yeah, he's in his early 40s. He's probably only going to do this for another couple seasons. He's gonna bank on it while he can, right? And fair enough, who cares? He's out of the championship race for a little bit.
L plan didn't go through.
And Jeremiah did bring up to me, he said, hey, there's articles about him talking to Lawrence and really liking what he sees. And I just thought he's sucking up to the new boss.
Yeah, see, that thought ran across my mind. But here again, I just kept going back to the fact that he hadn't done that at other teams.
Right.
And so I don't know. I mean, I guess I could have been being played in the terms of like with him being now in his 40s that maybe he was just, turning over a new leaf where he's now going to compliment his team and talk nothing but good thoughts. But it just, something felt different. So, because that's not Fernando. That's not.
Because he's not the type of guy. Everybody knows he's an F1 villain. He's kind of redeeming that these days. Like it's a little bit different of a viewpoint on him. But he has no reason to explain why he's leaving for another team. If it was just a money deal, I think he would just tell you.
Yeah.
They offered me more money.
Yeah, I got a really good offer from Aston Martin, and it's allowing me to stay in the sport for a few more years. I'm going to take it.
He has no reason to come on and say, no, these guys are going to be something.
Exactly. That was my point in that it felt off.
Yeah, and so credit to him. And now would they be doing this without him? I don't know.
See,
they probably would have made an improvement.
Okay. So,
because clearly Lance is in the top 10 pretty regularly, except for his DNF.
So Sebastian Vettel comes back. Is he getting third in these past 3 races?
I don't know.
I think it's a perfect storm kind of thing because we've got the Aston Martin team, who's this young, hungry team who's trying to make a challenge for the first spot. They want to win championships. They want to win titles. And then you have Fernando Alonso, who's coming off this giant stint where he was just traveling kind of from team to team, getting good results, but never really winning anything. And then he takes some time out of the sport, comes back, and he's got this new mindset, right? We talked about this in prior episodes. He's got this new mindset where he wants to win. He wants to win now. And so you have this perfect storm created where this young, hungry team and this guy who wants to get back to the top come together. And I think that's how we get the results we got.
To your Sebastian Vettel thing, he just struggled so much in that Aston Martin. I don't think he was getting the best out of the Aston Martin car that they had. So I have a hard time rationalizing that he would be getting the best out of this Aston Martin car. But could he finish around where Lance Stroll finished in 2 races? Yeah, probably. He could probably get a top 10 finish out of that car.
And you know what they said? They said 95% of the car is different. So
yeah,
maybe Sebastian Vettel was having problems with the car because it wasn't responding the same way that his Red Bull did or his Ferrari did in previous seasons. And now he's trying to make this car work and it's not working. So who knows? Who knows? Hey guys, this is Jeremiah, co-host of Turn 1 Podcast. We're going to get right back to this week's episode, but first I wanted to let you know where you can go to find us. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Turn 1 Podcast. If you want to check out our audio-only version, you can check us out on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts at Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. For any questions, concerns, you can reach us at trn1podcast@gmail.com. All right, let's get back to it.
we are highly impressed a couple races into 2023 with Aston Martin. But again, as we mentioned at the start, that did kind of lead us down the rabbit hole of what if some other big name teams. We're not going to go through the Williams and like Haas and AlphaTauri situations on why they're not doing well. It's pretty clear. There's either money things or driver situations, whatever. Let's talk some big names. I don't want to spend a ton of time on Red Bull, but I've got 4 major things that have led them to the success that they've had in a very short amount of time. We did the history of Red Bull a couple episodes ago. And so we talked about all of these on there. Adrian Newey, Christian Horner, Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez.
Pretty much.
Adrian Newey, obviously, what's his exact title? Is it technical officer?
I
technical
don't know
director?
if he's technical director or I think he's chief technical officer.
Okay. So every F1 team has a chief technical officer and a technical director, but they all seem to have different roles depending on the team. Some seem higher, some seem lower, some seem more car involved, some seem more personnel involved. But Adrian Newey essentially has been the cornerstone and the backbone of building the Red Bull cars for the past couple of seasons, well, for a long time actually, and really driving the success of Max Verstappen's career.
Yeah, for perspective, first of all, he is the chief technical officer.
Okay.
But more important than that, he's won 11 Formula One constructors titles. That means he's built 11 championship winning cars.
In a sport where, I mean, the car is king and you build it without your driver in mind.
So in a world where the car is king, he's the king of kings.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
It's pretty awesome. So they have him who, clearly when you have the fastest car, it makes the job on your drivers and your team a lot easier.
Sure. I mean, yeah, because at that point they're fighting with each other, and that's about it.
You have to really have some bad strategy to mess up having the best car on the grid, don't you?
Let's go into our next segment.
Christian Horner, obviously we talked about in the history of Red Bull how he got brought on by Helmut Marko and Dietrich and
right.
all those folks at Red Bull. And it was just a great hire at the time. And clearly he's steered the Red Bull ship in the right direction. They dominated the early 2010s. Mercedes then took over as they changed into the new hybrid era, and then now they're back to, I'll say they're back to dominating, right? You've gotten 2 drivers' championships in a row, a constructors' championship, and you're on your way to that same thing again.
Yeah, finishing every race 20 seconds ahead of everybody else.
Yeah, so I think they're on a good path there. Max Verstappen.
That would be the biggest one, probably.
The fact they identified him at 15, 16 years old, or was he 14 when he entered the Red Bull?
He skipped F2.
Yeah.
So
he was somewhere between 14 and 16 when he entered the Red Bull.
He didn't have a license
realm.
yet. I know that.
Yet he's out there cooking at 200 miles an hour.
Like that's just ridiculous.
So obviously Verstappen coming in, he had his time with Daniel Ricciardo, where honestly we've had our talks about Daniel Ricciardo, but I think that actually helped Max Verstappen's career because he was having to fight for a place of the team and a place on the grid. It wasn't just you come in and you run the show now.
No, he had to beat the Honey Badger.
He was the second driver behind Ricciardo.
Yes,
there was no 100%. Doubt about that. And then Sergio Perez. We talked about how they experimented with Gasly and Albon, and it just wasn't there. It wasn't happening. They went for the veteran. They went for a guy that had a race win. They went for somebody that could get consistent podiums. Just good decisions.
Yeah, I feel like whenever you make good decisions like that in concession, they kind of feed into the next good decision, and you kind of get this positive momentum built up to where you're making the moves necessary to win the title.
Right. And I think that the next steps for Red Bull, Sergio's going to be there for a little bit. I don't know how much longer. He's under contract, I think, for at least another season after this one. So, 2 2 or 3 more seasons with Red Bull, maybe. But that's good because this is, I'm not even going to say it's the prime of Max's career. It's part of Max's prime where you don't need a new young hotshot trying to fight for your number one driver's seat. You've got it locked down for several seasons.
Oh, yeah.
But in 2, 3, 4 years, however long Sergio's there, however long they want to keep him, then they'll start looking for their replacement. They'll bring him in. Max will still be winning at the time, ideally, so long as they get the car thing figured out. And then you'll have your next generation.
Yeah,
your next
they'll wheel in Yuki Tsunoda.
Yeah, they. Timeline wise, yeah. I mean, as long as he's still in the sport, if he can hang on for 3 more seasons.
According to Lance Stroll, he's the fastest out there. Or not Lance Stroll, Lando Norris.
Lando Norris, yeah. And every time we play F1 on equal performance, Yuki Tsunoda wins the race. I don't understand. Okay, Mercedes. What do you got on them?
Well, for one, probably the start is them replacing Bottas. And, that could be kind of controversial because it's like, well, yeah, but look who they replaced him with. Yes, look who they replaced him with. Exactly. A threat to their number one.
Yeah, a threat, kind of. He did. So George Russell placed higher than Lewis in 2022, but wasn't a threat for the top contenders. It was more that he directly replaced Valtteri in his role as second driver in terms of the points he was earning.
Right. The points stayed consistent, but look at the mentality look at the mental game that it did to Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah. He wasn't out there helping Lewis win like Valtteri was because Lewis wasn't winning last year. We know that was the case. And so he'll get there. I think they'll figure. I don't think that wasn't a mistake replacing Valtteri with George. I don't think that's the point we're trying to make. It's just the weird timing of it all.
Right. So it was the replacing of Valtteri Bottas along with, unfortunately, I think where you were going with this initially, and that's the rule changes that happened in 2022.
Yeah. You want to get into personnel here? Mercedes had so many people leave their organization at a very critical time to not leave an organization. Okay. 1, James Allison. You're going to hear a lot of these names a couple of times because as we started to dive into this a little bit more, it gets very convoluted with everybody working for everybody else at some point in the same exact roles and titles.
Yeah, it's pretty much a fancy game of musical chairs.
So apologize if I have to read this off the screen because their titles are on here a couple of different times. James Allison was the technical director of Mercedes during the Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri years of domination, right?
Okay.
They move him to the chief technical officer, which at Mercedes has less of a hand in building the actual car.
Okay.
Little odd with the titles. Technical director, more hand in a car than chief technical officer. Mike Elliott moves to the technical director role, and this all happened about midway through the 2021 season.
Right before the changes.
Yeah, so what happened in 2022 to make that a big deal? Why would somebody changing a job in 2021 matter?
Well, I mean, Mercedes was on top in 2021, so I guess that's whenever he would have his biggest stock with other teams in terms of who would want him. But other than that, I mean, the fact that he's on the number one team, I mean, the rule changes, it's kind of like you're jumping ship with an expectation that something's going to happen. So, like, he jumped ship right before the rule change, right?
Yeah, like I don't want to deal with this here.
Exactly. Maybe he saw something coming. That's a thought I didn't even have whenever we were doing the research to this.
No, I didn't think that either. But basically, the reason that you don't want any of your high-ranking personnel leaving so every 5 to 7 years, Formula One decides we need massive regulation changes. Right? Yep. They change the engine structure and design, the power, the battery size,
the tire size, how big the car is.
Going to a single-piece rear wing over the multi-piece, all of that. Every year they do minor changes. Like this year they raised the ride height to remove porpoising, but that wasn't considered an overhaul.
Right.
2022 was an overhaul of the regulations of Formula One. That's why they rolled out all new cars, right? So you expect there to be some shakeups in the standings, right? Like it's not going to be Mercedes dominance across the board, but you still expect them to be good. So moving your technical director, the guy that builds the cars, to a new role and replacing him all 6 months before you have to have a brand new car.
Not the best look.
Because they're probably already designing that car. I could be wrong, but they probably spend a good bit of time. They have people working on their current year's car, maintenance and upkeep and all that, and upgrade packages. But they're building a new car behind the scenes.
They are. During the whole 2021 season, the 2022 car was being worked on. I can guarantee it.
So I don't know if that was a total Wolf move, or maybe somebody asked for a promotion, or somebody else left, or whatever caused these dominoes to fall. But James Allison and Mike Elliott's moving somehow affected the Mercedes' ability to build a car. Aldo Costa, somebody that is mentioned in a couple different YouTube videos as being an integral part to designing cars and engines and chassis and all that fun stuff. He leaves in 2019. So we're a couple of years before the regulation change, but Toto Wolff called him a pillar of the team and said that he helped them lead through the hybrid area, through all of Lewis and Nico's championships. Aldo Costa was the guy behind the scenes getting that car done.
Okay, so he comes to Mercedes right around the time that the rule change happens and busts out a winner.
Yeah.
Just a pure dominant winner.
Because he did come to Mercedes, which we'll get to when talking about Ferrari in a minute, right at the same time they start winning.
I mean, it lines up pretty well.
Yeah. So him leaving, we were talking about this before we started doing the podcast. 2021 was Mercedes' last year where they won the constructors. Obviously, Max took the drivers in the final race. But you kind of look at it as one of those things like, were the people there in 2021 for Mercedes just running off of what had been built prior to that?
Right. Well, I mean, it's like you said earlier, every single year minus the every 5-year gap, there's a subtle rule changes, just small, minute ones that don't really mean much.
Right.
But then after the colossal amount of time passes, they decide that they want to completely overhaul how the cars look, how they drive, everything about it. So I guess, yeah, in that sense, him coming over to the team in that kind of time frame, I mean, it all lines up perfectly.
Yeah, so he leaves and they start to struggle. So they go into 2021. They do fine with what they had, but again, a lot of their big personnel had changed by that point. Andy Cowell, probably Cowell. We had to go listen. So like one of the names we had to go listen to 1,000 interviews on to get the name said right. But Andy Cowell, he was the director of Mercedes powertrains.
Okay.
And what are Mercedes and Ferrari best known for?
Their powertrains.
Their powertrains.
100% power that they produce.
And he left in 2020.
Right before the rule changes. So yes, to your point, 2020 things go south, but it seemed, or 2019 rather, we'll start there, when
Right.
Aldo Costa left. It seems like, because like you said it earlier, the small rule changes, it leads it to where they can go all of this time and kind of coast on the car that they've already built under these regulations with small changes here and there.
Exactly. So looking at Andy Cowell, you have him in 2020, Aldo Costa 2019, James Allison in 2021. 3 mainstays of your car. You have the car designer, the builder, and the engine manufacturer. All different going into major rule changes. And then finally, and I don't know how this has affected them necessarily. I don't think we've seen a lot of strategical errors from Mercedes. It's more car performance. But James Vowles was the chief strategist at Mercedes. He goes to be the team principal of Williams.
Right.
Toto Wolff said that was not a big weakness for him leaving, which is pretty insulting. But that all lines up. I mean, you've had 4 or 5 major pieces of your organization, and then suddenly you go from the dominant constructor and driver championship to barely holding on to 3rd or 4th in the constructors championship.
I mean, it's all kind of out there, right? I mean, the dates line up exactly how you said. You have these 3 people leaving right before the rule changes. The rule change happens, and they can't build a car that is worth anything.
Yep.
I mean, granted, it's still like a 3rd place car right now.
Could be a second
arguably
place car.
2nd place. You know, if they put all the parts in the right spot, and I don't know what their personnel looks like now in terms of how good they are in their roles, but we see what's happened in these past few years, and it's just not as good as it was back in the 2019, 2018, basically the start of the turbo hybrid era.
All of those folks at Mercedes were like, look, we got this right, but
I can't figure out these rules at all.
We ain't going to be able to do this again, so we're out.
Yeah.
And
I'm not getting blamed for this dumpster fire.
We're going to go to a new team with lower expectations. Okay, the last kind of big constructor we want to talk about, Ferrari.
Yes, Ferrari. Their last their last Constructors Championship, 2008, Kimi Räikkönen and Felipe Massa.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. we have Rory Burns, right? He was the chief designer for Ferrari from 1996 to 2006.
You got to start saying 19 instead.
Right. So in that time, from that entire period, he was working with what? Felipe Massa and Michael Schumacher. And Rubens Barrichello. He was winning championships left and right. Michael Schumacher plus the constructors. He leaves in 2006. And in 2007, I think he had like a partial hand in it. It wasn't necessarily like they kicked him out, and he more like moved on.
Consulting role.
Right.
That.
So in 2007, they introduced Aldo Costa and moved him up to his role. He was already with the team working underneath him. And to some respects, he likes to credit Aldo Costa with the car that was produced in 2007 and 2006, when really I want to say he still had a pretty good hand in that.
Yeah, I debate that. I'm going to use the example. If you're familiar with football or the NFL, the Dallas Cowboys in the 90s were dominant. They won 2 Super Bowls under Jimmy Johnson, and then they fired Jimmy Johnson, bring in Barry Switzer, who then proceeds to win another Super Bowl with the team Jimmy Johnson built. Kind of seems like what Ferrari did with Aldo Costa.
Right. So here's the thing. Aldo Costa takes over 2007. They win the Constructors Cup in Constructors Championship rather in 2007 and 2008. So to your point about the Mercedes earlier, feels kind of like they're coasting off of their 2006 car.
Yeah.
It feels like those are championships that should belong to Rory Burns.
Yeah, you had it figured out, and it worked through all the little minor changes until something big was rolled out.
Right. So after 2008, after their last championship, we slowly see this kind of gradual, I don't want to say, I mean, it's a decline for sure because they get knocked down, I want to say fourth, but then they kind of teeter around, fourth, third, fourth, second, third, fourth. They never really get back up to the top.
They run in and out a ton of different drivers, people, veterans.
Oh, and then if we're going to talk about who's been replacing all these people, Roy Burns goes to Aldo Costa. Aldo Costa gets replaced by Pat Fry because he can't figure it out. Pat Fry gets replaced by James Allison, who also can't figure it out because then James Allison gets replaced by Mattia Binotto, and we know what happened there.
It's interesting because it's like systemic within Ferrari because all these names that we're mentioning have figured it out elsewhere.
Yeah.
Aldo Costa cracked the code at Mercedes, right?
Right.
James Allison had it figured out at where was he at Mercedes as well, building the car for them. But then they go to Ferrari.
See,
problem.
I had mentioned this before we started the podcast. I want to bring it back up. I think that Ferrari has, maybe the corporate side has a bigger hand in kind of what happens than it should.
Yeah.
I feel like the fact that these guys were able to go to different teams and have success kind of tells you that they weren't the problem. It kind of tells you that they had reins on them and they were never set free.
Yeah, I can see that.
So to that point, I'm going to blame, I don't know, I guess Ferrari's as an organization on this one.
Look, Ferrari.
Okay, easy, because they have a lot of power in this world.
We know what you're doing. We're tired of it.
Let's not get canceled by Ferrari.
When you do the look and point at the camera, we're getting down to business.
So we see Mattia Binotto take over that kind of the taking over the production of the car, and we have pretty good success. Ferrari climbs their way back up to the top, and they're fast. But then what happens to Mattia Binotto?
They said, hey, you're really good at what you do, so we want you to do something else.
Like what? Where does that make sense? Where? That'd be like them saying, listen, Horner, I know that you're a mastermind in this project, but listen, Adrian Newey's just been building great cars. We're going to make him run the team. Because that makes sense.
This guy in the pit stop did a 2.2 second pit stop. He's now over the whole operation.
We want him driving. Like, it doesn't correlate, man. You don't go from being really good at building the car to, okay, you're really good at building one aspect of a F1 team. How about you run the whole thing? That doesn't make sense.
No, and I guess you can see that in some people, right? Because there are the engineers that can step up into the role. But did they see that in Matteo before? Or was it just, hey, man, you make a car that's faster than every other car, so you need a promotion? That's where I have the issue with Ferrari. I think that's what they did. They had somebody that was really good at their job and said, run the whole thing.
Right. Well, let's look at other team principals. We've got Fred Vassar, who's the team principal of Ferrari now.
Right.
He's been a team principal. He was a team principal at Alfa Romeo, and before that in the feeder series. He's been a team principal. Christian Horner, he's been a team principal.
He was
for
a racer
years.
and then he was running teams.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, you don't go from I build a really good car to I'm going to run the biggest F1 organization in the sport.
You still got time to go hiking with Gunther somehow.
Yeah, and hop in a Beetle or whatever it was, go cruising through Italy.
I don't know what it is with Ferrari, because again, we mentioned 4 or 5 names that have been with other organizations and they all did well at the other organizations and not well at Ferrari. That leads you to believe that the problem is with Ferrari and not with the individuals.
Yeah, I mean, that's what my take from it is. So and who knows? Maybe Ferrari climbs back up with Fred Vasseur. Who knows?
They'll be good at some point. Like, and not to say they've been bad in the past 20 years. They just haven't been Ferrari.
They haven't been number one.
And it's because now here's the other thing. So we talked about with Aston Martin and Red Bull and Mercedes. It was all the decisions that they made to either help or hinder their success. With Ferrari, it's not really the decisions that they're making, I guess. It's more so just how people work in their organization.
Yeah, and like I said, with the whole, I think that the organization has a bigger hand in it than it should. The corporate world maybe has a bigger hand in it than it should. I don't know. I don't know for sure. I'm not inside the Ferrari corporate offices. But what I do know is that people at Ferrari aren't doing good. Then they go to another team and they do good. I mean,
or they were doing good at another team, come to Ferrari and don't do good.
It's pretty linear. I mean... But let's not lose track about what this podcast episode is about. This podcast episode is for Aston Martin.
2 camera points.
Because Aston Martin is beast mode this year. They are doing so good.
Even if they finish 3rd or even 4th, that's an incredible step up. It does look like currently 2nd is a fight with Mercedes. From the start of the season, it looked like they had 2nd place locked up, but there seems to be a little bit of a battle going on. But I'm interested to see how it plays out, because that will show other teams, hey, this is doable. Hey, Haas. Now, AlphaTauri's not going to do this, but hey, Haas, hey, Williams, hey, Alfa Romeo even. If you hire the right people, you get the right facilities, you find the right driver, and you can't even say money whip anymore because there's a cost cap. It's decision-based at this point.
No, you just put it all to meals.
The catering bill can't get too high.
Yeah.
But no, they're saying to these other teams, hey, Haas, if you want to do this, here's how you do it right. Get the right people, get the right equipment, get the right car. Don't linger on the thing that isn't working just because that's what you built 3 years ago and now you're stuck with it.
Right.
Fix it.
You're right. So with Aston Martin now, at this point in the season, we're 3 races in. Fernando Alonso gets 3rd place in all 3 races. Lance Stroll kind of teeters in the top 10 somewhere.
DNF'd in the one because of a reliability, which is another thing. So you push a team to its limits, you push a car to its limits. This is a brand new car like we talked about.
That's a
I
good
don't
point.
think they know the limits. Do we get halfway through the season and suddenly their engine is blowing up every race, or all the your tie rod mechanisms, whatever's a structural component of the car that keeps it together, those just start failing and breaking.
It's very possible.
And they suddenly end up back in 7th in the constructors.
Well, regardless of what happens, I am interested to see how this next race is going to go. The 4th race in the season is the Azerbaijan or Baku Grand Prix. And with it being so technical in the first half, and then as it gets to the end, it's just this long straight as it gets all the way back to the start finish. I really want to see how this Aston Martin is going to turn up, because I don't know about its straight line speed in comparison to like the Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull. I don't know. I mean, we've seen the technical side of it. I guess we've seen the speed because of the Australian Grand Prix or the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix.
Yeah, but it's a lot of it's not straight line speed.
Exactly. That's my point.
Neither one is straight line speed.
So we need to see what their straight line speed is going to be, because that straight at Azerbaijan is long.
That's where Red Bull's going to get their 40-second
win. Easily after like 5 laps. 40 seconds.
That one straightaway is going to give them 2 seconds a lap, which is going to add up over time. Okay, that is all we have for what teams are doing right and what teams are doing wrong, some of the big decisions that they made. If you have any feedback or comments, if we got a name wrong, if we missed a very big part of any of this, if we missed a big hire or a big personnel shift.
Yeah, if y'all saw stuff that we straight up did not see in our research, let us know, man. Give us a comment down below. Let us know in our email. Put it on Reddit, whatever you want to do. Tag us, let us know.
Yeah, shoot us an email to trn1podcast@gmail.com, or like Jeremiah said, turn1podcast on TikTok or Instagram, or turn1 on Facebook. We love the feedback. And again, we can watch a million YouTube videos, we can read a million articles, but if you're a fan that's been following this continuously for years, if not decades, you're way more in the know than we're going to get out of those articles.
Right. So basically, anything that we missed, let us know. That's
Awesome.
all we want to know.
With that, we'll see you. Thanks, guys.
Bye, guys.